You look at Trump's tariff policy. Of course, it's important to know what he said today, but I know by tomorrow it might be different.
Everyone's kind of worried with all this stuff going on. What do you make of all this?
What's going on right now is unprecedented, as far as I can see, in the history of economic policy. And to him, that's like running a business at a loss, even though it's nothing to do with running a business. Trump's understanding of economics is basically zero. Do the goals make sense? If you had these goals, would you use tariffs? The answer very simply is these are extremely bad policies, badly targeted and based on misunderstandings of the underlying problem. That doesn't mean there isn't a problem, but it's not this problem, and it's not going to be solved in the way they set out.
I doubt you've seen or heard of Gary Stevenson, have you?
I don't think there is any plausible wealth tax which would offset taxing income.
Could you outline some sort of growth plan? Could you give Rachel Reeves some advice?
First of all, she inherited a very, very difficult situation. They've made serious mistakes, absolutely. But I think it's fraudulent to say there's some simple solution because, in my view, there isn't.
All right, everyone wants to know what's going on in the world. Trump, trade, tariffs, UK, growth. Well, today, Inspire Us, we're in central London at the Financial Times headquarters to talk to the main man, Chief Economist Commentator, Martin Wolf. No better man to talk to unravel all these issues that are very complicated. He's been the commentator for almost 40 years, and he's written a book after Trump's first rise called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. Hope you enjoy. Leave a like and subscribe to this channel. If you like what we're doing, join, become a member, and support us. And yeah, you're in for a treat.
The Inspire Us podcast.
Diaspora of Nigerians, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah, there's a big diaspora here.
It's gigantic, yes.
Yeah.
It's the largest African community, isn't it?
I think so.
In Britain, African-British community.
I think so. I think London is like so many nations, like second home.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Okay, let's go.
Shall we start?
Shall we get going?
We were just speaking a little bit before about consuming content and on social media and all these things. And now with Trump coming in, there's been every day, Twitter. How are you dealing with that? Because we find it a little bit overwhelming.
Well, the answer is I'm still a newspaper reader and a website reader. So I get most of this via those sites. And we report on all this. If it's really important, it's going to be reported. I've never been a Twitter reader. I've never tweeted. I absolutely never. I really limit my access to social media to reading things on Facebook by friends and family. I mean friends and family. And the one WhatsApp group, which is my family. So I'm not really in any of this. And I find that anything really important is reported. And from my job, which is opinion, not reporting, I need to keep up with what's going on in that area. And I do. But I don't need to absorb all this background stuff. I try to focus on reading serious analytical material, which helps me understand, as it were, the story behind the story, which is what I really write about.
I guess that is the best way kind of to go about it, just to have this filter. Maybe everyone else that's on social media can bring to you the good information. Because we're on Twitter, that's where we kind of stay up to date on the news, and it's so
overwhelming.
Well, there's limited time. I have a certain way of working, which I've developed, seems to work still. I decide what are the big stories, and then I start reading about it. And I read major sites like the FT, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg. I read academic sites, Project Syndicate, for example, many of the really good think tanks, and they pick up a vast amount. I know who's doing research in these areas. I look at the international organizations, and over a day or so, I can pull out pretty well all the major pieces that are being written on this topic, and of course, the major news events. And that's enough for my purpose. Then it's a matter of shaping it into my perspective. And of course, the advantage I have is that most of the subjects I write about, I've been following for 40 years, 50 years. So I have a backstory. I know how we got where we are. I've sometimes written books about it. So for me, managing this sort of world is not too difficult because, as it were, the noise of today is a pretty small part of what I'm writing about. Of course, it's important. So you look at Trump's tariff policy, of course it's important to know what he said today, but I know by tomorrow it might be different. And I'd have the advantage that I sort of know the history of all these policies, how we got here. And that's what I write about, and that's my comparative advantage.
Yeah, with this tariff stuff, it's just update. I remember, boom, he first came out with the billboard, all these countries, and then China comes in with the retaliating tariffs. And then Trump's like, all right, we're bringing it up to 125, and then they match it. And it's like, all right, 250. So it's always kind of going, but everyone's kind of worried with all this stuff going on and all this unpredictability. What do you make of all this?
Well, what's going on right now is unprecedented, as far as I can see, in the history of economic policy, certainly in the history of trade policy. And so what can you make of it? As you rightly said, there's an immense amount of noise. It's very unpredictable. We don't really know what policy will be tomorrow. It depends on the influences upon him. So I think essentially we can make the following. The general shift is protectionist. The details are constantly changing, and that unpredictability is itself a very important part of the policy environment. And so what we know is that the world economy is disintegrating inevitably as a result of this, but we also don't know where it's going to end up. And we know that business in this environment can't really make rational decisions, so they're frozen. That's enough. We already know these things, and that's very significant. And we probably know that it's likely to stay like this for nearly another 4 years, maybe longer. It'll do a lot of damage.
A lot of people are kind of bashing Trump. We've spoken to a lot of economists who, some of them say, well, no one really knows if he has a strategy. No one's in his head, obviously. But a lot of people are saying that he is not being smart with his economics and that his tariffs are a detriment to the American economy. And I was seeing yesterday already, the IMF announced that the predicted growth of the US is now going down. What do you think of his tariff strategy, if it is a strategy, and is there some upside? And some people also say that this could be, there's been a downfall in American manufacturing. Something has to change, and maybe a drastic change is what we're seeing and is what needs to be done. So what do you think?
Well, I'm very much a critic, but I think one has to separate out different elements of this story. And the big ones are, do the goals make sense? Second, if you had these goals, would you use tariffs? Would that be your main instrument? And the third is, and if you were to introduce tariffs, would you introduce them in this way? These are three very different aspects of it. I think that there is an argument to be made that, from my perspective, that the global economy needs rebalancing, in the sense that, and it was part of my book on the financial crisis. I wrote a book, which I think was published in 2014, called The Shifts and the Shocks, maybe it was a year earlier, which was on the financial crisis. And in discussing why the global financial crisis happened, the big collapse of the banks in 2007 to 9, I argued that an important element in that was, in that story, was the so-called global imbalances. What did that mean? Well, a number of economies, and probably the most important were China and Germany, built their growth. There are others, but they're the most important. Built their growth in the early part of this century around export surpluses. It was particularly clear with China. Its current account surplus peaked at 10% of GDP, which is an enormous number for such a big economy. I think it's 2008, roughly then. And of course, if a country is running huge surpluses, somebody else has to run deficits. And the country that is most able to run large deficits to offset these huge surpluses is the US by definition, because it creates the international currency. So people are very happy to hold it, and it's very big. So the combination of those two realities means that it can run deficits, which are big in relationship to its economy, and huge in dollar terms, more than anybody else. And it ended up running the countervailing deficits. And that was how the global economy was balanced in terms of macroeconomics, demand and supply, if you like. That's one way of thinking about it. And the problem was that in order for this to happen, the private sector or the public sector of the US had to run huge financial deficits. That's just a matter of logic. They're the counterpart of the huge current account deficits or capital account surpluses. They're the same thing, two sides of the same coin. They were the counterpart. And up to the financial crisis, they ran huge private sector deficits, financial deficits. And after that, they ran huge fiscal deficits. Now, what that means is that they were accumulating debt. First, it was private sector debt, and then it was government debt. And when the private sector debt got too big, most of that was basically in the internal sector. Internally, it was bank debt and other forms of private sector debt, corporate and household. When they got too much, there was a crisis because people thought all these borrowers in the US are not actually solvent. They're not creditworthy. We've got to stop lending to them. And we had a financial crisis. The private borrowing collapsed, the financial sector collapsed, and the government replaced them. So you can argue, and I do think that these global imbalances played a very large part in generating the financial crisis in the US. That was the biggest effect. There's a secondary effect, which you mentioned, which is that if you're running a huge current account deficit, you have to run a large trade deficit, more or less. And in the US, the trade deficit was in goods, right? Services account has always been very strong. The US is very strong in export of services. So basically, the US lost a huge amount of production in labor-intensive manufactures. Now, my view is that was real, it was significant, but most of those activities were going to go anyway. And because the US just doesn't have a comparative advantage in labor-intensive manufacturers, they were not going to go on making simple clothing, textiles, and a lot of other assembly jobs. They just weren't competitive. What the US failed to do was realize how quickly this was happening. They could have used safeguard protection as a way of managing that. They didn't. And they didn't really provide any place-based policies to help the affected areas. And similar things happened in Europe, happened in Britain too, but earlier, mostly earlier in the 80s. They didn't, to help people through this shock. So there were two sides of, if you like, the global imbalances, the huge trade surpluses, and the change in comparative advantage. One was the financial weakness, and the second was the shift in manufacturing. Now, I think those are realities, and they were very badly handled, and they had very real consequences. So that's first point. There are genuine problems. Now, the question then is, would tariff protection be the best way of dealing with these problems? Now, here, there are, the answer is no, in my view, very clearly, but I think we have to say why, and I will separate out the two dimensions of the problem. Imposing tariff protection does not of itself solve balance of payments deficits. A trade deficit, there are complexities here in how you deal with GDP accounts, and I'm going to ignore those for the purposes of this discussion. Doesn't really make huge difference. But basically, if you run a huge current account deficit, that means that spending in your economy exceeds output in your economy. That's true by definition. So when you're running a current account deficit, it means that the spending of residents, well, more or less, the spending of residents exceeds national income, okay? And that creates a deficit. It's just another way of saying you've got excess spending. Do tariffs affect this? No, not. They only affect it to the extent that tariff revenue leads to a reduction in the fiscal deficit. So there is an effect there, but it's not huge. Ultimately, you have to, and of course you could generate revenue in other ways. But ultimately, spending and income have to be brought closer together if you want to reduce your current account deficit. So the main impact of the tariff is that it shifts the composition of the sectors of your economy producing tradable goods and services. This is quite complicated, but broadly speaking, if you raise tariffs, you will shrink your imports, you will increase the size of your import competing sector, but in the process of shrinking the size of your import competing sector, you will certainly shrink your exporting sector. And you can see this directly and indirectly. I can't go through all the mechanisms because it takes a while. But essentially what happens is, so your import competing, relatively less competitive sector grows. The exporting sector is adversely affected by the shift in the exchange rate, which will tend to appreciate once you reduce imports.
And the dollar has fallen.
The dollar's falling is I think a temporary process. In the long run, the real exchange rate will appreciate, and it will because you simply need less imports. That's not true overnight. That's true over several years. And of course, in addition, the inputs that exports use, much of which is manufacturers, will cost more because you've got huge tariffs on them. And that will shrink your export competing sectors, which use tradable inputs. So the net effect, I think, will be overwhelmingly not to reduce the current account deficit. As I pointed out in one column, if you look across the world, countries with very high protection often run huge current account deficits. They're not affected by protection because you have to adjust income and expenditure. But you will change the composition of your tradable goods and services sector in the direction of the less competitive parts, because that's what import competing firms are. Firms that are competing with imports tend to be less competitive than the firms that are overwhelmingly competitive in exports, because they are, by definition, really competitive. So you shift the production of your tradable goods and services sector towards less competitive sectors. You don't increase them overall. And while you might increase to some extent employment in your manufacturing sector, it will be offset by losses elsewhere in agriculture, in services, and in parts of your exporting sector. So if you have a problem like this, you need to rebalance demand and spending in your economy, which in the case of the US means worldwide. I'll come to how you will do that later on. But tariffs on their own will not fix this problem. We know that. We've known that as economists for half a century or more, actually, much longer. Then the final question is, let's suppose you wanted you do want to use tariffs, so you want them to be effective in order to get people to invest in import competing industry. Let's assume you ignore everything I said for, you want to do that. Then what you have to do is impose tariffs, do them in a sensible way. We can discuss what that would look like. It wouldn't look like individual tariffs against every country in the world. They will be overall, because you don't want to create lots of distortions in relative prices between the imports coming from every single country in the world. Just think how complicated it would be to work out, well, who's going to be supplying me with this good? Is it going to come from Germany, or is it going to come from Japan? They're all going to have different tariffs in the Trump formulation, which is really ridiculous. You just want a uniform tariff, and you want it to stay. So the standard way of doing this will be to impose a uniform tariff, probably. There are some qualifications to that. And you then say, well, this is the tariff in the next 15 years. And then you decide to invest. None of that's has happened. So my view is it's not a reasonable objective. It's not, the tariff is not an effective instrument, and the way they're doing tariffs is a complete mess. What should they do? This is the last thing, since you asked these most fundamental questions. What they should have done, you say, who are the countries running huge surpluses? The most important are, in fact, China, Germany, Japan. Germany and Japan are allies.
India?
No, it's relatively small. The current account surplus of India is pretty trivial. In fact, I don't think it has a current account surplus. I think it has a current account deficit. But that I haven't looked the last year or two. There are some number of smaller rich countries. Switzerland has a huge one. Singapore has a huge one. But it's very small relative to the world. It's huge relative to the economy. Only big countries really matter for this purpose. And then what you would say is, we're going to put a tax on the exports of China and of Germany, or on the capital exports, that will be even easier, of these countries into, say, the US. And we will keep that tax on the capital imports of these countries until they introduce policies designed to reduce their current account surplus. Now, that will be a targeted, clear policy. Some of my friends have argued for this. Even quite classical economists have argued for this. And that would make sense. That would be, whether it will work, whether it would change the policies of these countries, I don't know, but it would be targeted at the real problem, which is the global imbalances, I think. And then you would introduce subsidies or very targeted protection to support the industries that you decide are really high priority. High priority for security reasons, for employment reasons, whatever they are. You would have to decide who they are, and you'd decide the priority in relationship to your policies and your priorities, not in relationship to what you think everybody else is doing. And you certainly wouldn't pay the slightest attention to bilateral balances, because there's no reason why you should have balanced trade with every country in the world. It's as absurd as expecting that you as an individual have a balanced trade with every commercial firm you deal with. Of course you don't. So the answer very simply is these are extremely bad policies, badly targeted, and based on misunderstandings of the underlying problem. That doesn't mean there isn't a problem, but it's not this problem, and it's not going to be solved in the way they set out. And so I think it's basically a disaster. At the end of this, the global trading system will be demolished. Nobody will have security, and the investment won't happen because nobody in business knows what policy is going to be next week, let alone 10 years from now. And the investment horizon for a major investment is at least 5 and often 10 years.
And it takes time also to move manufacturing investments.
Well, that's what I mean.
But I think what's interesting is how you started by saying, what is the goal, and will tariffs get to that goal? And that's when I can start to question, what is the goal for Trump and these tariffs? Because he does talk about the debt. Yeah, we're collecting all this money from this, but is it really about the debt? Is it really about, or is it just a power play? Is it he wants to renegotiate? Because even here you're talking about how America has this deficit and China, for example, has this surplus. So they've been able to grow with this deficit that America has. So maybe he's playing on this deficit, on this power of the American economy to be able to then negotiate something. But
well, I think so. Let's separate again. I don't know what's in Donald Trump's mind. Working out how Donald Trump thinks is, for me, basically impossible because it's so alien to me. I think that's true of most,
Everyone.
exactly most economists, but even most people.
You're such a unique
But you
guy.
raised two aspects which I think can be so. One is, it's a power play. He likes power. He likes being the center of attention, and the tariffs allow him to attack pretty well every country in the world to get a favorable deal. And that's a lot of that is clearly the fun of exercising power. I think of it as just like a protection racket. If you're running a protection racket, you do separate deals with everybody, right? Yeah. But then the question is, that's all there is to it. Well, a second element is pretty clearly that he recognizes it's popular because a lot of people have lost their jobs. There are people who will vote for him if they think he's going to bring the jobs back. And by focusing on manufacturing output and protection as the tool, he's going to get those votes. So it's a political play, and it works. I mean, so protection is popular, and that's very targeted in the sort of places in the red states where the collapse of manufacturing has been a very important problem, and it clearly is in the case. So the second reason why it's good politically. But I also think, pretty clear from the way he talks, Trump's understanding of economics is basically zero. So what he thinks is, when I spend money on imports from somebody, that's a loss. That's a loss. I'm spending money and it's a waste, even though I'm getting something for it, but forget about that. And if those people don't spend as much on me, then I'm running on my goods and services, the US, then I'm running a deficit. To him, that's like running a business at a loss, even though it's nothing to do with running a business. He thinks of the trade of countries as like a business. And if the business doesn't sell more abroad than it pays abroad, it's running at a loss. So he wants to run a surplus, a profit in every bilateral relationship. He doesn't think of it like you and me going out to buy things from different shops and so forth. He thinks of it as a business running at a loss. I think that is his vision of the world. So if somebody sells him his country more than it buys from his country, it's a swindler. It's swindling. It's not reciprocal. A reciprocal relationship is one of complete balance. And I think that's actually how he thinks. So I don't think it's a fraud. I think that's how he thinks. He's thought that way for a very long time. From an economist's point of view, it's complete nonsense, but that's how he thinks. And I don't think that is fraudulent, because he comes back to it. He also thinks, final comment, that when the US ran a surplus and had very high tariffs in support of that in the 19th century, it did very, very well, and we should go back to that. And so that's a historical perspective. And so he sees the free trading regime as a swindle against America and a loss of the policies that really succeeded. And he thinks he's going to reindustrialize America through these policies. And while I think he's completely wrong, it is in support of a genuine theory that he has. It's just a very peculiar one.
Martin, I wanted to bring us back to issues at home. So I doubt you've seen or heard of Gary Stevenson, have you?
Don't think so.
But so he's an ex-city trader, and he's doing some really important work highlighting wealth inequality in this country, and he's really, really taken off. But people criticize his message. So he essentially says is that we should tax wealth, not work. And yeah, his critics say that this is too simplistic, and that he's almost kicking away the ladder to all the young people in this country who do want to work hard. How would you address this gross wealth inequality that we have? And do you think the message is a bit too simplistic?
Well, I don't know his work, though. It's not the first time he's that sort of idea has floated. I don't think there is any plausible wealth tax which would offset taxing income. It depends on what you mean by taxing income. Do you include value-added tax? Is that a tax on income? It's a tax on current spending. So very crudely, so the first is numerical plausibility. The total tax take in our country relative to GDP, very roughly, is about 40%. Okay? 40% of GDP is taxed. I don't know the exact ratio of wealth to GDP. It's probably 3 times, something like 3 times. If you taxed 40% of GDP from capital alone, you would be taxing vastly more than the income from capital. That's vastly more than the profit share in GDP, a total income from capital, all of it. So to pay this tax, people would have to draw down their capital. And so the economy would become decapitalized. I mean, basically, people would be selling capital. They couldn't sell it to other people here because there wouldn't be people who would buy it. So you'd be selling it abroad. How else could they pay this tax? Alternatively, they would be handing the capital stock over to the state, and the state would end up owning it. That doesn't seem to be very sensible. So at the macroeconomic level, there is no plausible tax on capital that could offset the full range of income tax that we charge. Now, it's true, some of the income tax includes corporate taxes, but corporate taxes are not quite the same as wealth taxes. And some of them are taxes on land, but that's pretty small part of the tax revenue. And some of it's tax on spending. I don't know whether he's, as I said, thinking of that as an income tax or as a tax on capital, but basically it would be really a variant on income tax. So an expenditure tax is very close to an income tax. That's a complicated issue. So basically, I don't think there's any form of capital taxation that can offset income tax in full. That said, it's also true, we don't want tax capital in such a way that we actually leads to capital destruction, because we all live on the capital that is invested. But you can tax some things relatively without creating destruction. And the most obvious is land. So, because land isn't accumulated, it's a natural asset. And much of the value of land is just location. And you can certainly increase taxes on land. Henry George argued for that in the 19th century, and I've argued this for a long time. Our property taxes are very low. They're not efficient. So you could imagine taxing land reasonably higher, at a higher level. You could make the income tax more progressive, so tax wealthy people more, and a lot of their income does come from income from capital. The problem with that is it also it's likely to lead to capital flight and or capital destruction, just less savings and less investment. So there's damage there. And most people would argue that the scale of increased taxes we could raise by very high taxes on high earners, including large owners of productive capital, the amount of income you would get relative to the loss of incentives as overall wouldn't really be very large. So without going into all the detail, my own guess would be that without trying to destroy the economy, you obviously don't want to destroy all capital, you could shift income tax probably somewhat more in a progressive direction. And I've indicated the tax on land is the most obvious way. Some people suggest you could impose a wealth tax of perhaps 1 or 2% of the value of the wealth, which would be quite significant. 1 or 2% of the wealth would pay perhaps 6% of GDP. That would be quite extreme. That would make a difference. But you can see, since we spend about more than 40% of GDP, it wouldn't be enough to actually pay for everything that the government provides. In the end, you can't really support a state that spends 40 to 45% of GDP without income taxes, because income is inevitably the principal source of tax revenue at these levels of the state. So if you really want to do what he says, you have to start cutting spending. And most of the spending in the British state, like most modern states, goes on welfare of various kinds, pensions, health, things like this. And these are the things we don't want to cut. So directionally, I have sympathy with this, but as actually a means of funding the state we want is going to go very small way to solve the problem. It's just not a big enough resource unless you're prepared essentially to penalize all capital owners, in which case, who's going to accumulate capital? Who's going to save and invest? I mean, obviously, they're not going to do so.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense. But Rachel Reeves as well. I think today it came out that private sector spending or output has contracted massively and her borrowing costs have soared. So could you outline some sort of growth plan? Could you give Rachel Reeves some advice?
Well, my own view was this. First of all, she inherited a very, very difficult situation, which goes back, I think, 40, 50 years. Some people could say even 150 years. I don't want to go into that economic history. My answers tend to be long enough anyway, I know. So let's forget all that. Given her inheritance, I think they clearly needed to raise taxes, and they should never have ruled out the broad-based tax increases. So income taxes, including property taxes, needed to be rethought. National insurance is, of course, an income tax, and it's a very bad tax. So they should never have ruled all that out before they got into power. Because they did that, they ended up making the principal source of additional revenue employers' national insurance contributions, which is a tax imposed on employers for their workers, you see. And of course, it's a way of making employment more expensive. Well, if you make employment much more expensive, they're going to employ fewer people. And since it falls on capital, it's abuse of the income accruing to capital. They've got less to invest, so they're going to invest less. And that's exactly what's happened. So I think that was a terrible policy decision. It was a result of the decision to rule out almost everything else. And then, because the economy is growing so slowly, partly because of this and partly because of all the shocks we were experiencing, including the trust shock and all the rest of it, we have very, very high interest rates now, and that of course affects the cost of borrowing dramatically. So she got herself into a terrible problem. The big problem is she's got tremendous fiscal pressures in a very slow-growing economy. To deal with the fiscal pressures, she must either cut spending or raise taxes, both of which will cause huge economic and political problems. And she has, in addition, to generate growth. A strategy that will deal with all this is actually very, very hard to find. I think many of the things they're trying to do are in the right direction, planning reform and all the rest of it, promoting innovation, and we can go through some of the details, but I think they really have simply got themselves into a very big issue. It would help if we hadn't left the EU. I think that would have helped. Obviously, the Trump tariffs are going to make all this worse. So they've made serious mistakes, absolutely. But I think it's fraudulent to say there's some simple solution because, in my view, there isn't.
Yeah.
Martin, thank you so much.
It's an absolute privilege to be able to speak with you, and we could ask you so much more, so much more.
But we know you're a busy man, so
another
we'll end it
time.
Here.
Yeah.
We'll
Come
do.
back in a few months.
All right, we'll
Thank
do.
you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.